Okay, hey, welcome to the Essentials podcast. I'm your host, Chase Johnston-Lynch, and we've been kind of like running online or remotely here with Big Hondo Radio's programs. And I was talking to a good friend of mine who I'm joined with today, Dan Halpern. All right, and we had talked when we were doing our worldwide conversations, but we also have this love of comics, movies, and cinema, that kind of thing. And so we wanted to, share that love again in this particular type of podcast that's going to be strictly around that form of media. So first, let me introduce once again Dan Halperin.
Hey everybody, what's going on? Thanks, Chase, for having me.
Hey man, no worries, man. Thanks for coming back. We had some issues early on. Hopefully, we're getting these things up and running. But you know how it is that it's the internet
Mm-hmm.
and everything. But basically, when we were talking about our favorite films for childhood, we were talking about theaters and everything. But then we said, okay, well, let's do something specific. And you said you wanted to target specifically the Christopher Reeve Superman of '76.
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought, okay, yeah, we're going to talk about that. We have some notes and everything because it's not just one movie, but two. But we figured, hey, let's go deep dive into the
Mm-hmm.
history of Superman. Because this was a character that was like very important to my generation, and even the generation before me, because Superman has been around for about 90 some odd years now.
Mm-hmm.
What did I say?
38,
1937.
1938. 38.
Yeah, 1938. So for a long time. And, we were kind of like going back and forth because superheroes at that time were like kind of more of they came from more of a pulp type of background. They were generally like guys wearing masks and gloves and everything, punch and sock them. They didn't really have any special powers. And then so when the two young lads, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, came along, they kind of like decided to make a hero around an alien. Use their imagination, and believe it or not, back then, Superman didn't even fly, but he was just a stranger from another planet, a strange visitor from another planet who could leap
Mm-hmm.
tall buildings in a single bound and everything. He was dressed like kind of like a strong man from the circus. He could stop bullets, they bounced off of him, and he could lift cars, and, the children of that period ate it up. One of those children were your dad and stuff like that. And
Mm-hmm.
so you were telling me you had a love of Superman, but it began with him. Why don't you start there?
Yeah, so my father, back in the 1970s, worked at the parent company that released Superman, Warner Communications. So they owned Warner Brothers. And I remember like once, I was probably 9 years old. So I was of like that sort of critical age where you're reading comic books and I started out with Richie Rich, right?
Hey,
Those
I
are,
love Richie Rich. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I started out like, I think I was maybe the summer before, like 77. I got introduced to Richie Rich and I ate up all the Richie Rich. But
Yeah.
then Superman came along and, little boys love Superman. They love Batman. They love Spider-Man, right? So it was sort of like that kind of, I graduated from Richie Rich to Superman. And it was like
Mm,
at that critical age of 9 years old, that film was coming out. I knew that my father had something to do at his company with it coming out, right?
mm,
He didn't work on it per se. It was more that he was like on the corporate level, and it was a big event within the company because, it's Superman.
yeah.
Um, but I also grew up with like, my father was born in 1930. So he would have been introduced to Superman when he was 7, 8 years old himself. And I know he read it as a kid and he loved it. And
Mm,
so it was a great way for father and son to, bond together. Sort of like that seminal moment and event. And that was a really, looking back at it now, a really kind of bonding experience with us as far as, around a central character.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and then I kept like kind of getting more and more into comic books as I got older. I eventually probably drifted away from being intensely into comic books when I was around 15 years old or so. Like, I got more into movies, but like, man, when I was like 10, 11, 12, 13, I would go into the comic book shops and like, I was like, anything Superman, anything like, so I used to buy like old Superman comics. And this is like in the
Yeah,
late 70s, early 80s when they were still cheap enough to get, And
yeah.
also, like, I made the mistake because I was into just collecting everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lois Lane, Superman, Action, Jimmy Olsen,
Superboy.
Superboy, all those titles. So I was like, I wanted to have them all. So a lot of times I would buy comics that were like in fair condition, good condition. I wasn't thinking about like the value part of it. You know what I mean?
No,
I was
no,
like,
no, no.
ooh, I'm going to, have this, Superman number 357, and it's a near mint, and it's like, put into the Mylar, and have it graded.
That don't,
My,
I don't
my
think that actually. I don't think that actually really started to become a thing until like around the '80s. I think I went to my first comic convention around like '79 or something like that.
right.
Where that's when your parents like get rid of those comics or something like that. You know what I mean? So I mean, kids used to just like buy a book, roll it up, put it in their back
Mhm.
pocket. So yeah, it was a later thing for you, the old collecting thing, I would presume,
Yeah,
and
and then
stuff.
I do remember a story of like, again, I was 10, 11, 12, not exactly sure what age, but I walked into a comic book shop looking for old comics, and there on the counter was Superman number 12, and that was a golden age comic. and,
Hmm.
and I like my mouth dropped. Like, I knew what it was, and I knew how old it was, and I said to the guy, "Is that what I think it is?" And he went, "Yeah," but it was. I still have it, but it's in poor condition. Like, I
Yeah,
haven't taken it out of that plastic sleeve in over 30 years, because it would probably just crumble apart. So yeah, he went, "Yeah, you can have it." He gave it to me because he couldn't sell it. Now today, if that thing was in near mint condition, and what are the odds of that? That thing would probably be worth $5, 6, 7, $8,000, $10,000. Unfortunately, in the condition it's in now, it's probably worth $100, $200.
dude, I
You
gotta
know,
tell you,
but I
man.
ain't gonna sell it. I mean,
Yeah, I gotta tell you, man. Like, I cry over like that whole factor of like in your collection, because like that one time as a kid, I actually like packed up some books, put them in a black suitcase, and went down to Penn Station,
Mm,
34th Street to a comic convention.
nope.
And I walked around and I
I
did all
did
that
that.
stuff. And then I went up to the tables where the artists and or the sellers were and everything. And I actually had books like that were like the first issue of Teen Titans, or the first issue of this and the first, and I'm thinking how much. And the guy actually looks at him, you know what I mean? And then he's like, "I'll give you I'll take the whole stack for 20 quid, well $20." You know what I mean? And it was like,
Then he and then he's
okay, to a
and he's gonna
kid.
resell it for like 200 or 2,000, right?
Dude, that's what I'm trying to say, bro.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, it scarred me for life. But let's get back to, let's get back. I mean, so when you were going to rebuy books, like you just said, like what I really enjoyed was back in the '70s, definitely, they were doing a lot of reprinting.
Mhm.
So what they would do is that like they would recognize that these stories are really good, and they would keep reprinting them, right? So like, let's say, do you remember Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes?
I think so. Yeah.
So like what it was is that believe it or not, that actually came out in the '50s. Otto Binder, and Paul Lewis, all that kind of stuff. That actually came out in the '50s when Superboy was a boy, and we were looking at teenage Superman. The point is, they kept reprinting them, like the original stories that came out. So you will always get like every 10 years, you get number one back again. So for the next generation to
Hmm.
read.
I
So
remember
when
that.
when you were looking around, looking at all the Superman issues and everything like that, but I'm just kind of curious. Do you remember the Superman Silver Age, which is pretty much like when Superman was always like where he was affected by magic, and it was always kind of like Superman turned into a goat. You know what I mean? Or affected by red kryptonite. The crazy stories that are like
Well, I
tied
remember
into the
Mr.
Silver Age.
Mixelplick, and I remember Bizarro Super,
Yeah, yeah,
stuff like that. Yeah, no, I would buy those Silver Age magazines back in the
yeah.
day because again, back in the '70s, they weren't that expensive. You know what I
No,
mean?
no.
I got really into like what I remember specifically is as I kept collecting, and the numbers kept evolving, so I would collect, I probably went back. This is where I could afford, probably back to like 1960, 59 or 60. So and then so I probably collected through the '70s, or even
Yeah.
contemporary, up to like the late '70s, early '80s, and when I would go through and I would reread the comics over and over again and look at the collection, I could see myself being more attracted or getting into the artwork, you know.
Yeah.
And then there's definitely was like a break. I kind of remember that the artwork dramatically changed. It became much more contemporary, like in the late '60s. It's almost
Yeah,
like they
like Kurt
fired
Swan.
all their old guys and they brought in like Bernie Wrightson. Goes, you know what I mean? Like Bernie Wrightson was the artist or was a writer? I always forget.
Bernie Wrightson was a writer, but basically at that time it would have been Kurt Swan and everything. The barrel tested Superman. You know what I
Right,
mean?
but also the way that like it went from a very kind of cartoony look to more realistic. You know
Yeah,
what I mean? And I
yeah.
remember like there was some Superman issue. I don't know whether it was Superman or Adventure or whatever. There was some issue like in the late '60s, which was basically like Don Rickles appeared on like the cover or something. You know,
Silver Age. Yeah.
like guess Don Rickles as like the villain or something, and you could see it on the cover. I probably
Yeah,
should
but
have like
see, you're talking about the time of the Super Friends, right? So, what the cartoon? And what will happen then is that you get a lot of like comedians making guest starring roles, like you get like Milton Berle or
mm,
whatever and stuff like that, making guest starring roles in the comics to try and reach, the younger market or the younger generation and everything like that.
mm,
So that will happen a lot at that point in time. But also too, it's just like the move on from there is that if you're talking about the '70s, you must have like experienced Superman on television, which for at that time would have been the black and white George Reeve Superman from the '50s.
right.
Did you ever watch those shows?
Oh yeah, sure. I used to watch them all the time, and then remember they were later on at one point or another. But even the ones in the late '50s, that a bunch of them were shot in color. You know?
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, '50s with a changeover from the kinetoscope. So when it first started, it was black and white, and then it moved to color. Because I
Right.
think lasted maybe I think like about 3 to 5 seasons and stuff like that because it did have syndication and stuff. So, but yeah, so initially it was a colored black
I
and white
watched
strip.
that, and I watched obviously Super Friends. And it was ABC. Was it Super
Yeah,
Friends?
yeah, the cartoon.
ABC,
Yeah, yeah,
and I never really saw any of the old serials. Like there was Superman versus the Mole
yeah,
Man.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly.
They weren't
Yeah,
on
two members.
TV. But yeah, I watched all that stuff. I mean, like I said before,
Yeah,
I ate it all up. Anything Superman related, and eventually Batman related. But like he was the first, right?
yeah, yeah. Superman was first, and then I mean we got Batman with the Batman '66, the Adam West Batman, of course. That also was iconic. That's a story for another day. But basically, but so by the time you got to the '70s, when you're devouring these things, so Superman was in all medium because he was also on radio as well. He's also one of the first radio
Hmm.
stars, along with the Lone Ranger, Captain America, even that radio series and stuff. But then brings us to I wouldn't say there was a lull because there was always something on telly, involving and stuff. There was always the cartoons I did, like I said about the Super Friends. But they decided to bring in, you know, Richard Donner, right, to make us believe that a man can fly. Now, I shared in that last episode that we talked about, like how my uncle took me to the pictures
Mm.
to first watch Superman,
Mm.
but you haven't shared that. So did you watch it with your dad or yourself?
I, I know I went and saw it with my father, but it would have been at like probably a premiere or something, and it was just like
Mm.
a big. It was just all big deal. But like, yeah, I think that like the whole sort of like, the opening title sequence, right?
Yeah.
Which I could still watch over and over again to this day.
Who couldn't, man?
But it's also like the buildup of like the fact that they open up with the comic book, right? And then they go into, the top of the Daily Planet, and then they go right into it. Like it's a slow build into it that they took their time, and the score. But I think the thing that really like got me was, look, today it's obviously sort of earlier green screen technology that doesn't look so great, but man, like in the late '70s when he's flying around all over the place,
Oh,
that
well,
that was like the shit, right?
this was like kind of like the original green screen stuff, man. Because I mean, like this was the one that set the bar for everything else. Because excuse me.
Mm.
Because also too is like like they actually like they began with blue screen and like this was like green screen. So it's kind of like, oh, okay, Superman or Christopher Reeve is laying on a green box. He's laying on a green
Hmm.
box and he's flying and everything like that. And that's what was kind of like great about Christopher Reeve was he wasn't like a known actor or anything else like that, but he really took to because they had the harness rigging and stuff like that, where they had to hang him from the top of the ceiling and everything, the grid. And he really took to heart what he was doing and what he was creating as far as the imagination was concerned. So the flying scenes were amazing. I mean, for people like us who like work in that field or whatever and everything like that, or I used to anyway, but we you could kind of like see the roughness when you look at it now. Like especially if you got like some kind of Blu-ray disc version, you
Mm.
know what I mean, of Superman. But it didn't matter because that was what the point of the thing, the tagline was: "You will believe."
Hmm.
And Christopher Reeve sold it. He sold it and stuff. And so let's talk about like some of the highlights of this film before as far as the downfalls. It's like, so what were some of the highlights for you? I mean, character or scene or whatever.
Well, I think that well, it's a multiple thing. I think as far as like really kind of reinforcing a man could fly is when the helicopter fell off the roof. You know what I mean?
Oh,
And he grabs it and Lois laying at the same time and up, and like,
yeah.
wow, that's like so fucking good. And it's a real helicopter, and obviously they built.
Even though that it's set off by that really cringing line where the where the pimp guy goes, "Hey man, dude," when he comes out of the revolving door,
Mm.
damn Jim, and stuff.
I
But
You know
yeah,
what's really great about that film too is like how much they let Gene Hackman go to town with the Lex Luthor character. They let
yeah,
him have like real fun with it, and it was
yeah,
campy. It wasn't taking all the way. And Ned Beatty as Otis, and Valerie Perrine as Miss Tessmacher, and every time he screamed Miss Tessmacher, and like I just always loved that.
yeah.
He was so over the top, but Gene Hackman's such a good actor that he could get away with it. And it's also kind of a role that Gene Hackman never played before. You know?
No, 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 no. Exactly. I mean, and obviously, Otis and Tessmacher were invented characters for the film, but it was kind of like a thing where, as you just said, it's like I think I think Gene Hackman may have just looked at it as, look, man, this is not great, so I'm just gonna really go to the other side of the spectrum, and by doing it that way, he made it great. Because if you think about it, if he didn't do that, what would it be? If he didn't ad lib and do some of the overtop stuff that he did, he made it that much stronger and easier to watch and stuff.
Right, because
You
he
know,
just would have been just like, oh, another evil henchman, and like, okay, you gotta, these movies, they're all kind of like the early Bond movies. They're all kind of, or even most Bond movies in a way, they're all kind of campy, right? Or
yeah,
they're all over the top.
yeah.
So you got to take these characters, and they got to go over the top. It's, but it's the right actor. I mean, the other thing about Superman because everybody talks about how perfect Christopher Reeve was for that role. And he was. I mean, he was born to play that role. He is that role. But again, it's the casting across the board in the entire movie. Whether it's Brando or why am I blocking it? Mom, Pa Kent, what's his name? Glenn Ford.
Glenn Ford, yeah. Oh my
Glenn
God,
Ford.
Glenn Ford dying on the road killed me. It killed me, man. Him having a heart attack in that
Yeah.
scene. Even Jeff East, who played, young Clark. But to me, let me just say, my quintessential moment in that film was Christopher Reeve when he was going to tell Lois that he was Superman. And the way he took, and I think there's even
Lois
behind the scenes on it. The way he took off his glasses and just like puffed out his chest, everything, because it's like everybody always talks about, come on, man, he's just wearing glasses. How do you not know it's him? But he really did something with his body in that moment as an actor that really sold it and it crushed it.
That's all that Juilliard training. When he
is it?
Well, yeah, you went to Juilliard. I mean,
hey, whatever. But all right, so
he was in class with Robert Williams, I think. So
because I'm just conscious on the time is let's look at like where it started to go wrong. So like what happened was Superman originally was going to be 2 movies because it was too long, right?
Right.
And everything else like that. But what had happened is that the Soul Kinds, who were the producers, foreign money, all that kind of stuff, they decided that Donner wasn't listening and fired him. Right? So they kind of like fired him. It was technically in the middle of production, but it was like by the end of the first one and moving into the second one. So, I mean, what do you know about that story?
Well, so it's very interesting. I was on Wikipedia before and I took a bunch of notes. And what's really fascinating about the development of Superman is all the different combinations of actors they approached and directors they approached while they were developing it, and and the script being written. And when you see the list of everybody, of that generation, you realize, like, man, if you took like any combination of these people, it probably would have been a really bad movie, because it's really it's so much of it's good because Richard Donner was a very good, like, I guess you would call him a journeyman director. You know what I mean? He didn't have a particular style, but he did the Omen. He did a whole bunch of other films. He did Twilight Zone episodes, The Goonies, but that was afterwards. But he was just he was a very good, he's very good at delivering a good end product. You know what I mean? And I think that, it's very interesting when you look at, like, I've always been of the opinion, for the most part, that, like, and you've seen this time and time again with films, is like when they go out and they get, like, it's directed by this director and they got these writers and they got these, they got like the A team. And a lot of times, like in the past, when they've put the A team together, the people who already have amazing track records, a lot of times it doesn't work. It busts out, because it's like what happens is, like, and it's classic here with the Saul kinds of doing my research, is that they just had a producer's mentality. And so a producer's mentality is like, oh, this director, is a star right now, and these writers are hot, and these actors are, A-level. Let's throw them in there, right? So it's very interesting. Superman was originally written by Mario Puzo from The Godfather. Now,
Mario Puzo.
That's a big leap to go from The Godfather to Superman.
Well, that's also how they got Marlon Brando as well.
That makes sense, that they would have gotten Brando. And then it was also co-written by Robert Benton and David Leslie Newton, who all wrote. Robert Benton directed Bonnie and Clyde. And then eventually Tom Mankiewicz came in. And I think Tom Mankiewicz overall, he was the son of Joseph Mankiewicz, who was a famous director.
He also was involved in Twilight Zone episodes as well, wasn't he? Joseph Mankiewicz.
Well, I think Tom Mankiewicz might have been involved with that. But I think Tom Mankiewicz was the one, and he was given a creative consultant credit I think he was the one who sort of crafted Superman to the most of what we see on screen. Like
Right.
what they're saying about Robert, like when I was reading Wikipedia, what they say about Mario Puzo is that he eventually wrote, like, for Superman 1 and 2, it was a 550-page script.
Wow.
And that they didn't use like any of the dialogue from him at all.
Right.
Ilya Salkind got the rights from DC in 1974, and over the years, the people that they spoke to about possibly being Superman were people like, now granted, put into context of the time, right? These are all big stars back then. Pacino, James Caan, Steve McQueen, Clint Eastwood, Dustin Hoffman, Robert Redford, Burt Reynolds, Stallone, and they even went to Paul Newman and said, like, you can play any part you want. You can play Superman or Lex Luthor. I can't see any of these guys. Oh,
No.
and Ali, Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah, yeah.
You know, and look, Ali
Well,
couldn't act for shit.
well,
Ali was
where did Richard Lester come in?
Richard Lester came in.
Because wasn't he like the editor, or wasn't he was
No,
working on
because
it already?
Richard Lester actually was a director. He did Hard Day's Night
He did
and a
the. I
bunch.
know he did the Four Musketeers as well.
Yeah, I think
But
that what I read on Wikipedia is that he was brought in because at a certain point, Donner and the Salkinds were not talking, so he was like a intermediary, and eventually when they fired Donner, they had Lester come and finish it. But so what I read is like maybe like 75% of Superman 2 is Donner's work, and like you've seen over the years, you saw the Richard Donner cut that was released
yeah,
on
that's
home
what I
video.
was gonna say.
But also like Ilya Salkind's first choice in 1974 or early 75 to direct was Spielberg.
Was who?
Spielberg.
All right.
But what happened was, I think, is that the brother, you know, the father wanted to wait till Jaws came out, and when Jaws became a giant hit, they waited too long. I do think that if Spielberg had done Superman, it wouldn't have been this Superman, but it probably would have been a really cool Superman.
Yeah.
You know, who would have been in it and how it would have looked? I don't know. It would have had the John Williams music probably. But like they also had approached, it says here, Coppola, William Friedkin, Sam Peckinpah.
That's like
George
going through.
Lucas,
That's like
it
going
said,
through the list. That's like going through the A list and everything, And I mean, it needed to be what it needed to be. But so Superman 2, pretty much as you said, Donna was already shooting it when they
they made
decided to.
both together at the same time. And it was the filming for both of them was from March 1977 to October 1978 at Pinewood
Mm-hmm.
in England. And, I think that to shoot a year and a half on two movies where even big movies today might be 3 or 4 months schedule, maybe 6 months.
Well, it's kind of like the
Avengers 1 and 2
first time. It's kind of like the first time that they did a movie back to back. You know what I mean, and stuff like that. So yeah, it was rare, but it makes sense where it started out with the three, Kryptonians going off into space, and then they were going to get the bat. I think what I heard was that there was an original version of the beginning of Superman 2. It didn't start. It wasn't like what Donner shot. It wasn't at the Eiffel Tower or anything else like that. And also, there was a different way that it was bringing the three Kryptonians back and stuff. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, and I also want to say that it's interesting when you more stuff that I found, like Jerry Goldsmith, who did the score for Planet of the Apes, which we talked about the other day.
Yeah.
He was actually the original composer.
Okay.
And he didn't, and actually parts of his, I have to go on YouTube, or we all have to go on YouTube and look at the original trailer, but supposedly parts of the score from Apes is in the original Superman teaser trailer.
Wow, okay.
The movie was originally supposed to be released actually in June of 78 on the 40th anniversary of Action Comics #1, but got delayed for production reasons. And I thought I knew all this stuff because I do have DVDs here at home of Superman, but these DVDs are probably 10 years old. I didn't realize that there was a. This is highly unusual. I didn't realize that there was a television producer's cut Superman that's 3 hours and 8 minutes. Did you know
Wow.
about that?
No, 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 no.
There's a TV producer's cut of Superman, and what happened was is that the Salkinds, they kept the original. There was like before it was cut down by Donner or the editors, right, for theatrical release, the first rough cut or whatever. They wanted it for television, I guess, to probably for whatever
Do like a
reason,
mini series,
probably
maybe.
like a mini series or something like that. So there was what happened is that they after the movie came out, they sent it to television stations, and a lot of TV stations would they would end up either cutting it anyway because they
Yeah.
wanted time for their commercials. And very few of these cuts existed. And what it said on Wikipedia is everybody thought it was just an original 16 millimeter print at the time, just for TV stations. That's the way they used to do stuff.
Yeah.
And then Warner Brothers, about 4 or 5 years ago, found an actual 35 print of the cut, and they released it on home video in October 2017 onto Blu-ray.
Hmm.
So it does. So if you go to Amazon,
So if you see like a Superman producer's cut or TV cut or whatever, there's another version
there's
of a
3 hour.
longer version of it.
Yeah, the
I
3 hour.
wonder if that would have the original shots, the original scenes that Donner did or anything like that. Which would be
Might be.
interesting.
But it's what's interesting too is like we've always heard about director's cuts, right?
Yeah.
Never heard of a producer's television cut in my life.
No, but that was the thing back then, like the Daryl Zanuck years. Daryl Zanuck was a producer who was very hands on in the editing room. It sounds like the Sokans were like coming from that same head. That's why they always were button heads with Donner. But either way, man, it's like that kind of like brings us to the end of this thing because
Well,
we're over time now.
I just want to bring up a quick point. I think what's fascinating about Superman is that nowadays, or at least like when you see, promotion about behind the scenes on all these, Avengers or this film or that film, all the Marvel films or whatever, people think that these are well-oiled machines, and I think that then years later, when the real truth comes out, you realize like a lot of times they're just giant messes. And
yeah. And that's what I always find fascinating about watching commentaries and behind the scenes, because that's where those messages are generally shared. And, the geekophiles who really love that kind of stuff, that's where you find the gold in it. Mm-hmm. But I always think that those lucky accidents that bring in the actor, and even though they tell you who they originally was looking at, it's always that actor was always supposed to be the one. Because you always say, I could never imagine Will Smith as this character. You know what I mean? Or Muhammad Ali as Superman. But either way, Dan, thank you very much, man. This was really interesting and everything like that. Taking a look at Superman and the history of Superman and how it also relates, to time. And
Can I say one more thing? I know we're running out of time, but really quick. The thing I really love about Superman, I think a lot of people don't put into context, is that stylistically, it's 3 movies. That the stuff in Krypton the stuff in Krypton stylistically looks so different from his childhood in Middle America into Metropolis. As far as the way they're shot, they're framed, the tone, the editing style, they're totally separate. And that I think is really the biggest brilliance of that movie.
Well, they did the same thing with Man of Steel. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Krypton scenes with Russell Crowe and the Man of Steel was phenomenal. And everything else like that, and they gave us just a little bit more than they did with that Superman movie. But I think, he thought the same thing. So I forgot the guy who made the movie now. Brian Singer. No,
Brian Singer.
I know we said Brian Singer. The guy who made Man of Steel. Anyway, Snyder. That's it.
Zack Snyder. Yeah.
Definitely got to go now, Dan. So,
okay. Thanks, guys.
Totally enjoyed the conversation. We'll do this again sometime.
Cool.
Now Blake says he doesn't like my tagline, but I'm going to say it anyway. Blake, take us out of here.